but I did do some research when I got home. Turns out Devil's Tombstone has a history that goes back a lot further than I'd realized. The local Native American tribes considered it a sacred site, but not in a good way. According to what I could find, they believed it was a gateway to the underworld, a place where the spirits of the dead gathered to watch the living. Early European settlers reported strange encounters in the area. People going missing, unexplained lights in the forest, voices singing in unknown languages. Most of the accounts were from the 1800s and early 1900s, but there were a few more recent reports scattered across hiking forums and paranormal websites. Stories of hikers encountering groups of people dressed in primitive clothing, of electronic equipment failing near the rock formation, of that same unearthly singing echoing through the forest. The common thread in all the stories was the watchers, silent figures who observed from a distance before vanishing without a trace. I never went back to Devil's Tombstone, and I never will. The Catskills are full of beautiful places to hike, places where the only thing watching you is the occasional curious squirrel. I don't need to go looking for trouble in a part of the mountains where trouble seems to be looking for me. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my apartment, I swear I can still hear that singing. Faint and distant, but unmistakably the same ancient melody that followed me through the forest that day. And whenever I hear it, I remember those motionless figures standing in the tree lean, and I'm grateful I made it out of those woods when I did. Because something tells me that if I'd stayed much longer, I might not have made it out at all. Without my GPS or compass, I was navigating by memory and instinct, pushing through the underbrush and trying to put as much distance as possible between me and Devil's Tombstone. The singing followed me for what felt like miles, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers, sometimes swelling to an overwhelming chorus that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Whenever I stopped to catch my breath or check my bearings, the voices would get louder, more insistent, like they were drawing me back. I hiked for hours, fighting through brambles and deadfall, crossing and recrossing streams that I didn't remember from the way in. The forest all looked the same in my panicked state. Endless trees, rocky outcroppings, and that oppressive silence broken only by the distant singing. My legs were burning, my lungs were screaming, but I couldn't stop. Every time I thought about resting, I'd remember those motionless figures watching me from the tree line. By the time I finally stumbled back onto a marked trail, the sun was getting low and I was completely exhausted. I followed the blazes like a lifeline, practically jogging despite my fatigue, until I saw the blessed sight of the parking area ahead. My car was still the only one there, sitting exactly where I'd left it, but seeing it felt like coming home after being lost at sea. I threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and got out of there as fast as the dirt road would allow. It wasn't until I was back on the main highway, with normal traffic and civilization around me, that I finally felt safe enough to stop shaking. I never reported what happened that day. Who would I tell, and what would I say? That I'd seen some people in the woods who acted strangely? That I'd heard singing and found footprints? None of it sounded like anything worth calling the authorities about, even though it had scared me more than anything I'd ever experienced. But when I climbed back down, I found fresh footprints in the soft earth around the cairns. They were bare feet, or close to it, maybe crude moccasins or sandals. The prints were human, but somehow wrong, like the feet that made them weren't quite the right shape. The toes seemed too long, the arches too high, and there were a lot of them, far more than 3 people could have made. They circled the entire area around Devil's Tombstone, sometimes overlapping, sometimes branching off into the forest in different directions. I pulled out my phone to take pictures, but my battery was dead. That was impossible. I'd charged it fully the night before and barely used it all morning. I tried turning it back on several times, but it wouldn't respond. My GPS unit was dead too, and my analog compass was spinning wildly, unable to find magnetic north. That's when I heard the singing. It started soft and distant, like voices carried on the wind, but it gradually got louder and clearer. It was definitely human voices, multiple people singing in some kind of harmony, but the melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't quite a song, and wasn't quite a chant. Something in between that seemed to rise and fall with its own strange rhythm. The language wasn't English, wasn't anything I could identify, but there was something ancient and primal about it that made the hair on my arm stand up. The singing seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing off the rock face and filtering through the trees. I couldn't pinpoint a direction, couldn't tell if it was getting closer or farther away. And underneath the voices, I started to hear other sounds. The scraping of metal on stone, the rustling of heavy fabric, the soft thud of bare feet on earth. I didn't wait around to see what came next. I grabbed my pack and started moving as fast as I could back toward the trail, or at least what I hoped was the direction of the trail. But the smell seemed to be coming from the ground itself, seeping up through the earth around the cairns. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to climb up on the tombstone to get a better view of the area. The rock was rough and offered plenty of handholds, so it was an easy climb. From the top, I could see for miles across the forest canopy, and the view was honestly breathtaking. That's when I saw them. They were maybe a quarter-mile away, partially hidden in the tree-line, but I could make out at least 3 human figures standing perfectly still and facing in my direction. Even at that distance, I could tell they weren't hikers. They weren't moving, weren't gesturing to each other, weren't doing anything that normal people would do. They were just standing there, watching me. I fumbled for my binoculars and focused in on them. What I saw made my blood run cold. They were dressed in what looked like animal skins and crude cloth, all earth tones and ragged edges. Their hair was long and unkempt, and their faces were partially obscured by what might have been mud or paint. I couldn't tell which. But what really freaked me out was how absolutely motionless they were. They looked like scarecrows, except scarecrows don't watch you with that kind of focused intensity. I lowered the binoculars and they were gone. Not walking away, not moving to new positions, just gone. Like they'd never been there at all. I stayed on top of the rock for maybe 10 more minutes, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. But the forest had returned to that unnatural silence. No sign of the watchers, no indication that anyone else was out there. I started to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing, if the isolation and the weird atmosphere of the place had gotten to me more than I'd realized. No birds, no squirrels rustling in the leaves, no insects buzzing around. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. In 8 years of hiking these mountains, I'd never experienced silence like that. I finished my water, packed up, and kept moving, but the silence followed me. It was like I was walking through a dead zone where nothing lived or moved except me. The trees seemed denser somehow, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes that reminded me of arthritic fingers reaching toward the sky. The whole forest felt wrong, like I'd crossed some invisible boundary into a place where the normal rules didn't apply. About an hour later, I reached what I figured must be Devil's Tombstone itself, a massive granite outcropping that jutted up from the forest floor like a broken tooth. It was easily 40 feet tall and maybe 20 feet wide, with a split down the middle that gave it the appearance of a giant tombstone that had been cracked by some tremendous force. The resemblance to an actual gravestone was unsettling, especially with the way shadows played across its surface. I was taking some photos when I noticed the cairns. They were everywhere, little stacks of stones arranged in seemingly random patterns around the base of the rock formation. At first, I thought they might be trail markers left by other hikers, but there were dozens of them, all different sizes, and they formed rough circles and lines that didn't point toward any particular direction. Some of the cairns were obviously old, covered in moss and partially collapsed, while others looked like they'd been built recently. What really got my attention, though, was the smell. It hit me gradually as I moved closer to examine the stone stacks. It was sweet and cloying, like rotting fruit, but with an underlying funk that made my stomach turn. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and started looking around for the source, thinking maybe a deer had died nearby. I've always been the type of guy who needs to get away from the city every few months just to stay sane. Living in Albany means I'm close enough to the Catskills that a weekend trip doesn't require much planning, and I'd been hiking those mountains for about 8 years when this happened. I thought I knew the area pretty well, at least well enough to handle myself on the more remote trails. It was October 2019, and I decided to tackle the Devil's Tombstone area for the first time. The name alone should have been a red flag, but I figured it was just one of those dramatic names they give to perfectly normal rock formations. I'd read online that it was a challenging day hike with some decent scrambling, and the photos I'd seen made it look like exactly the kind of rugged terrain I was looking for. I parked at the trailhead around sunrise on a Saturday morning. The parking area was just a small dirt lot that could maybe fit 6 cars, and mine was the only one there. That wasn't unusual for the more obscure trails, especially that early in the morning, so I didn't think much of it. I shouldered my pack, checked my map one more time, and headed into the woods. The first few miles were pretty standard Catskills hiking: dense forest, rocky terrain, and enough elevation gain to get your heart pumping. The trail was well marked at first, but as I got deeper into the wilderness, the blazes became fewer and farther between. By the time I'd been hiking for about 3 hours, I was relying more on my compass and the general lay of the land than any actual trail markers. That's when I first noticed something was off. I'd stopped for a water break near what looked like an old stone foundation, probably the remains of some 19th century homestead that had been reclaimed by the forest. As I sat on one of the tumbled down walls, I noticed how quiet everything had become. I mean, dead quiet.